We're going to grab what's rightfully ours from your dad's fortune. Leave the house immediately." That was my stepmother, Diane, her voice filled with bitterness as it came through the phone. I felt my pulse quicken, but I managed to keep my voice calm. "Get in touch with my attorney," I responded, and then hung up. "I'm Sophie Palmer, and I work as a financial advisor here in Chicago, and I'm 34. My father died from cancer 3 weeks prior, leaving his large fortune and tangled interpersonal relationships for me to sort out. My stepmother, Diane, had always been jealous of my closeness with my father, and they had been married for 5 years. Over the years, she tried to create distance between my dad and me, but he knew what she was up to. Diane had no idea that my dad had actually been anticipating something like this. We had talked at length about his estate in the months leading up to his death as his sickness progressed. He watched her actions become more and more controlling and mean. She would try to keep me away from him by saying he was tired and should rest, and she'd screen my phone calls. But my dad wasn't stupid. "Sophie," he had told me during one of our private conversations at his workplace, "I've seen the way Diane treats you. I'm aware of her potential, and I'm not going to allow her to steal what rightly belongs to you." He'd already started collaborating with his attorney, ensuring his possessions would be shielded and correctly divided based on his desires. Months prior, the house I was raised in, where all my youthful memories resided, had been legally transferred into my ownership. A significant portion of his wealth was carefully allocated to me through unassailable trusts and legal papers, leaving absolutely no opportunity for meddling. Always a detail-oriented planner, my dad had even created video statements detailing his choices, as he expected Diane might try to challenge the will. As I was sitting here in my place, staring at my phone, I couldn't stop grinning at Diane's call claiming victory too soon. She was utterly clueless that her attempt to strong-arm me out of what I was inheriting was about to dramatically fall apart on her. Her attempt to intimidate me into surrendering my inheritance was about to spectacularly rebound on her, without her even realizing it. The lawyer my dad worked with would be reaching out to her bright and early with news she wasn't going to like. On occasion, the sweetest way to get even is to simply let people dig their own graves. I settled in with a glass of wine and booted up my laptop to go over the estate papers once again. The coming days were guaranteed to be fascinating, to say the least. I spent my childhood observing my father create his real estate empire from absolutely nothing. Since I lost my mom to breast cancer when I was just 12, it was just my dad and me for a long time. We ended up with a really close connection. He shared all his knowledge of the business world and money matters with me, which is why I ended up choosing the career path I did. Even though he was swamped with work, he always made it to my school stuff and never forgot to help me out with my assignments. That period in my life really made me who I am today. The whole situation shifted when Diane came into the picture. She was working as a receptionist in one of my dad's buildings, and they tied the knot just half a year after they met. I was 29 at that point, living independently, but I could see how she was trying to run the show and so quickly. Initially, it wasn't super obvious, like suggesting that my dad was too worn out for our regular dinners or saying he was too tied up to answer my calls. However, as time went on, her real personality emerged. Diane was 15 years younger than my father, and her spending was beyond belief. She completely redid the house, getting rid of everything that reminded us of my mother. She talked my father into buying her fancy cars and brand-name outfits, arguing she needed to look the part as his wife. I became increasingly worried as she started cutting him off from longtime friends and people he worked with, constantly criticizing anyone who didn't see things her way. My father's eyes began to open to what she was really like maybe 2 years back, right around the time his health started failing. He let me in on a secret. He discovered her snooping through his financial records in the dead of night, and he had also picked up on her raising some oddball questions related to his will and assets. That's when he started covering his bases. The reason I said, "I do," was simply because I couldn't stand being alone. He confessed this to me during one of his chemotherapy appointments. "But I refuse to let my blunder negatively impact you, Sophie. You're my kid, what I'll leave behind. All the things I worked so hard to accomplish were always destined to be yours." We spent his final months tying up loose ends and confirming every piece of paperwork was legally binding. He even made video recordings detailing the thinking behind his choices, in anticipation of Diane's attempts to portray me as a conniving daughter preying on a man in poor health. My dad always had a plan, no matter what, even as he neared the end. The burden of the faith he placed in me, along with his commitment to shielding me from Diane's avarice, only reinforced my dedication to uphold his desires and stand my ground. The moment I was flipping through old pictures with family from within the walls of my apartment, I understood the truth that the real challenge was only now beginning, yet I stood prepared. The day following Diane's menacing phone call, I linked up with Richard, my father's attorney and buddy of many years, at his law office. His demeanor was somber, yet resolute as he informed me of the most recent goings-on. Diane's legal counsel contacted me yesterday evening, Sophie. Richard was flipping through some documents as he told me that they intend to challenge the will, arguing your dad wasn't mentally stable when he altered it. However, unbeknownst to them, we've got it all on film. My father had made it a point to film each and every discussion about his estate, articulating his rationale clearly and proving he was in his right mind. What's more, his physicians even made records of his mental capacity while he was making these choices. It was almost as if he anticipated Diane would pull something like this. Richard went on to say that they are requesting a speedy court date. Diane is asserting she requires instant access to the funds to keep the house running. What she doesn't understand is that I've already had all the bills and services put in your name. I could feel my anger rising, remembering the way Diane treated my father in his last few months, limiting who could see him, keeping tabs on his calls, always lurking around when I came to visit. But my dad had outsmarted her, and now it was time for his planning to finally come to fruition. I asked when the hearing was, even though I was already sure this was going to be the critical moment. They want it done quickly, it's tomorrow morning, which actually plays to our advantage. They haven't had the opportunity to manufacture anything to support their case, and we have proof of everything. Richard gave a small smile. Your father was incredibly clever, Sophie. He knew precisely what he was doing, every step of the way. I couldn't fall asleep that night. I just kept replaying my dad's final days in my head and the ways Diane attempted to dominate every single part of his life. She even tried to keep me away from him in the hospital, saying he needed to recover. I don't think she realized that he and I had already put our plan into action during those irreplaceable last days. I took out the final birthday card he had given me, rereading his words. It seems that, Sophie, the greatest payback can be letting people get tangled up in their own self-interest. Diane was about to find out the precise meaning of that, come the next day. A strange blend of sorrow and resolve filled me as I got the hearing papers ready. It had evolved into something beyond just the money. It was about respecting my father's dying requests, as well as defying the woman who attempted to separate us. The day of the hearing dawned, bringing with it a palpable sense of anxiety at the courthouse. Diane, decked out in a pricey black dress, was sitting across from me with her lawyer, and she had this self-assured smile on her face. I bet she'd even brought along her grown kids, most likely trying to portray herself as the mourning widow surrounded by a caring family. I watched them whispering and peeking over at me, obviously anticipating an effortless win. As we waited for the judge, Richard told me, "Don't let them get to you." He assured me that everything was squared away and to just let the evidence tell the story. When Diane's attorney laid out their argument, it was basically what we'd been anticipating all along. I was portrayed as a conniving child who exploited a man near the end of his life, while Diane was presented as the dedicated spouse who sacrificed everything to look after my dad. He even had the nerve to imply that Dad's mental faculties had been impaired by his sickness and the drugs he was taking. He proclaimed with a flair for the dramatic, "Your Honor, what Mrs. Palmer really wants is just what her husband would have wanted, for her to continue living the way they did together and to safeguard the family house they created." At that word, together, I could feel myself getting incredibly angry. Diane had only been with my father for 5 years, and a lot of that time was spent using his funds and distancing him from the people he cared about. She hadn't helped in any way with the business or the house that he had built up over 3 decades. Richard, remaining collected, stood up to present our side of the story. "Your Honor," he said, "I possess not only the legal documents detailing Mr. Palmer's desires, but also video recordings of him and the reasons that led to his decisions." As my father's face filled the screen, the room went completely quiet. While he appeared worn out from being sick, his eyes were bright and firm as he began to talk. "I am making these revisions to my will while of completely sound mind. Sophie, my daughter, is the one who will ultimately inherit everything I own. My present wife, Diane, will receive ample support as outlined in our marriage contract, but she won't be taking over my company or our family's residence. I watched the color drain from Diane's face, which had previously flushed bright red. As more evidence was brought forth, her attorney seemed more and more uneasy in his chair. I'm talking about the recorded discussions, the mental health evaluations, and the detailed records that my father had painstakingly created. The judge leaned in, examining the documents intently. The medical records that demonstrated my father's sound mind were especially harmful to Diane's defense. And then came the evidence that did the most damage, her late-night rifling through his files, together with bank statements revealing questionable transactions she'd tried to make in the weeks leading up to his death. Richard went on to say, "Moreover, Your Honor, we possess proof that Mrs. Palmer tried to move a considerable amount of money from Mr. Palmer's business accounts into her personal accounts without permission, right before he died." Diane's face went from ashen to bright red. Her lawyer leaned in to urgently whisper something to her, but she waved him away and jumped to her feet. "He promised me the world," she blurted out, completely losing her cool. Sophie turned him against me. "I am entitled to that house. I was his wife. Mrs. Palmer, please sit down," the judge commanded sharply. "That little fit of yours isn't doing you any favors." I didn't say a word, just kept watching as Diane's carefully put-together image started to fall apart. Diane kept complaining, and the murmurs from the people watching got even louder. Then Richard introduced the last piece of evidence, a video that had been recorded a couple of weeks before my dad passed away. In it, he went into detail about his worries about Diane's actions and why he made the choices he did for his estate. Everyone in the room went quiet as they watched my father explain how Diane had tried to cut him off from everyone and take control of all his money. He was frail, but his mind was sharp. "I want quiet in here," the judge yelled, hitting his gavel hard. "Because of all the clear proof that's been shown, I'm ready to announce my decision." I took a deep breath and held it, even though I was already pretty sure we'd won. The amount of work my father had put in beforehand didn't leave any questions unanswered. But actually hearing the judge say that everything my father wanted in the end would be respected made me feel like a huge burden had been taken off me. "Moreover," the judge stated, fixing his gaze on Diane, "if you try to dispute this decision, we will delve deep into the questionable money matters that have come up today. Is that understood?" The judge's pronouncement reverberated in the room as Diane sank in her seat, finally quieted. Her attorney hastily collected his documents, already aware that they'd lost entirely, but what followed was even more gratifying than the court's decision itself. In addition, this court is mandating a comprehensive review of every financial exchange completed by Mrs. Palmer during her marriage to the man who passed away, the judge went on. "With the proof we have of attempted unauthorized transactions, this situation will be handed over to the proper agencies for them to examine." The blood rushed from Diane's face. Her children, who had been so cocky and assured only moments ago, were now hurrying out of the room, without even pausing to wait for their mother. That painstakingly constructed facade of the mourning spouse had totally fallen apart, showing the reality that my dad had always seen. As we were exiting the building, Richard gave me a closed package. "Your dad instructed me to hand this to you following the session," he told me softly. Inside, I found a letter penned by my father, accompanied by photos of my younger self and him, standing tall in front of our initial property venture together. "My beloved Sophie," the letter started, "if you are looking at this, then everything unfolded as it should. I always figured Diane's real personality would come out at some point. Though I'm sorry I ever let her get involved with us, I always had faith in your abilities and smarts. The company is all yours now, everything we worked to create. You were always the one I could count on throughout this whole thing." Reading that made my eyes start to water, but they weren't tears because I was upset. My dad had left me with one last thing of value, more than just the money, but the feeling of knowing the right thing happened. He made sure, by thinking ahead and being careful, that the truth would come to light. Later that day, while sitting in my dad's office, which is now my office, I spotted Diane's expensive purse still there in the corner. She'd have to come pick up her stuff before long, but it'd be the last time she ever came to the house that never really belonged to her. A couple weeks after the court case, I started to sort through all of my father's things. Every room brought back memories, but his office hit me the hardest. As I sat at his desk, I was surrounded by 3 decades worth of company documents, family pictures, and souvenirs. It was right here that he taught me about real estate, showing me how properties were valued and breaking down how the market worked when I was hardly old enough to understand any of it. Our attorneys had arranged a specific time for Diane to come and get her possessions, with them overseeing the whole thing. Getting ready for her last appearance here, something fascinating turned up, a secret area in my dad's desk holding a diary. He had written down everything, the ways Diane tried to control him, her private phone conversations, and her sneaking around his papers late at night. He was fully aware of what she was like, yet went along with it while making sure the things he truly cared about were safe. What came to light during the police's look into Diane's money dealings was even bigger than what we thought it would be. In his last few weeks, she'd tried moving close to $300,000 out of my father's bank accounts. The investigator working on the case discovered very much the same pattern in her previous relationships. She had a pattern of going after rich, older guys, although it seems none of them were quite as ready for her as my father. I dove headfirst into managing the company, building upon what my father had already established. A lot of them had known me since I was little and had seen my father getting me ready to take over. They told me tales of him showing them photos of me graduating from college, my initial real estate transaction, and all my accomplishments, so proud of me. I got a surprise phone call one night from Thomas, Diane's son, as I was looking over some old agreements. It was Sophie. He started out kind of unsure, and then said he wanted to say he was sorry. He went on to say that they were aware of what their mom was up to, but they didn't do a thing to prevent her. Dad was a decent guy, and he deserved a much better fate. His words caught me off guard, but they also gave me a feeling that I was right all along. Apparently, even Diane's kids were wise to her little game. Thomas told me that she'd tried similar cons in the past, going after rich, older guys. Although my father had been a different story, he'd been prepared for her and completely turned the tables on her. The company did really well with me in charge, and I ended up putting my own stamp on what my father had built. I created a scholarship for people wanting to get into real estate, and I called it after him. The first person to receive it was a young lady whose dad had given up everything to pay for her schooling. It felt like everything was coming together the way it should. The day Diane showed up to get her stuff was definitely awkward. She had 2 movers and her attorney with her, and she didn't look quite as fancy as she had at the hearing. As she walked around the house, I saw that she spent extra time looking at some things, especially the pricey decorations she'd talked my father into buying. Richard told her firmly that she could take what she had bought herself. The rest stays here. He had a complete list of everything that belonged to the estate. Diane's face showed her frustration when she understood how little she was actually entitled to. I kept my distance during this last visit, working in my father's office while they packed everything up. I could make out what she was murmuring about, even with the door ajar. It was all about treasured family possessions, even though none were legitimately hers. Richard had to intervene on multiple occasions to prevent her from walking off with things that belonged to my mom or had been part of our family's history for ages. The high point for me was definitely when she tried to take possession of this old grandfather clock, claiming that my dad had apparently promised it to her. What Richard did was produce this picture that was about 3 decades old. It showed the clock right there in our living room when I was a kid, way before Diane ever came on the scene. He then said, quite clearly, "Mrs. Palmer, please don't make this any harder than it already is." The clock stayed put, along with a whole bunch of other stuff she tried to say was hers. As Diane was getting ready to go, she lingered in the entryway for a moment. I briefly entertained the idea that maybe she would try to say she was sorry or make things right, but instead she just said it, filled with resentment. "You might think you're the winner here," she said, "but you're gonna wind up by yourself just like your dad did." I came out of the study and stood right in front of her. "My father was never truly alone," I responded, trying to keep my voice level. "He always had me. I was his real family, and I was there for him until the end. That's a concept you never quite grasped, and you never will." She walked out without saying anything else, and I experienced this really deep feeling of things being resolved as I watched the door shut after her. The house felt different, almost brighter, like a dark cloud had dissipated with her absence. I wandered around, running my hands over things I knew so well, and for the first time since losing Dad, it really felt like my space again. A year had passed, and I found myself in the office that used to be my father's and now belonged to me, going over our most recent purchase of land. The company had really taken off while I was in charge, pushing into different areas of business, but always sticking to the values Dad made sure we never forgot. I kept his picture on the desk. It reminded me of everything he'd shown me. The inquiry into what Diane had been doing with the money was over, and it showed she'd been doing dishonest things long before she ever met Dad. She was going to have to deal with the law for trying to take money from his accounts when he was sick. Last I'd heard, she had picked up and moved, and the picture she'd painted of herself as a sad widow had completely fallen apart. I finally felt at peace within the walls of my own home. I'd kept the things that reminded me of my family while also making changes that made the place feel more like my own. The living room had Mom's artwork up again, and that old clock was still ticking away in the front hall. That sound was always something that calmed me. But the biggest thing was that I'd made sure to carry on what my father started the way he would have wanted, not just by protecting what he had, but by growing it. We'd set up a scholarship, and it had already given 3 bright kids a chance to make something of themselves in real estate. You find comfort and peace in the strangest places sometimes. What really got through to me was seeing the admiration and affection our staff had for my dad whenever they spoke of him. They'd tell me these stories about how generous he was, about his honest way of doing business, and how much pride he had in me. These little instances really made me realize that what he left behind wasn't just about the buildings or the money, it was more about the people he impacted and the morals he passed on. Just last week, I stumbled upon this photo album that I'd never seen before in his office. Tucked inside was a letter that he'd written just a few days before he passed away. He wrote, "You've always been tougher than you give yourself credit for, Sophie. Keep in mind that building up a fortune isn't the only thing that matters. It's also about staying true to your values while you're doing it." I've made him feel a level of pride he never even thought possible. The true win wasn't simply holding onto what belonged to me. Instead, it was about carrying on my father's name by living according to the standards he set. The company is still doing well, but more importantly, it's still running on the same honest and ethical principles that my father always stood for. Ultimately, Diane's attempts to steal what she had no right to expose the inner strength that I got from my father. You know, sometimes the sweetest victory isn't winning a legal battle. It's demonstrating that in the end, honesty and decency come out on top.